one tetrahedra and make it and interdigitate it a second time, we end up with what's called a star tetrahedron. And this star tetrahedron, when you join all the points or the corners, makes a cube. So there's a relationship between these three shapes. What that means is that the tetrahedron, when it interpenetrates itself, looks like this shape here. So this shape here is really a cube when you join those vertices. I'm really looking at a cube. If I turn it around, you might see the cubic nature of this. So the basic shape that really creates this whole lesson maze is really, it all goes back to the tetrahedron, which is what Buckminster Fuller, the visionary that gave us the geodesic domes, he was obsessed about the tetrahedron as the omni-stable shape that creates all atomic structure. Currently there's a phase in Australia where a lot of people are wearing these sacred geometrical shapes around their neck so that they can sit these shapes on their heart for a specific reason, because these shapes emit a specific frequency. It's really all about just remembering that we have all this knowledge. It's all in ourselves. It's the memory of everything is within us. So these are just like triggers to activate consciousness. And it's not that we really depend on them or need them. They're just like a spark to help remind us of our original nature. Because really, how many spheres would we need to make this shape? I could say that really we could get 8 spheres together like this. I could glue 8 ping pong balls together like this and join the 8 centers and get that star tetrahedron. So this is, even though it's a cubic shape, if you look at it inside, if you connect all the white balls, the 4 white spheres, that's a tetrahedron. And if you look at the black balls, that's another tetrahedron, but they're interpenetrating. So really you're looking at the infrastructure of the star tetrahedron here. A lot of people are referring to this as the 8 original cells, and they say that it currently rests at the base of our coccyx, that all the knowledge that we want to access vibrationally and through the spirit records is stored in these spheres of consciousness at the base of the spine. My particular fascination with the 5 Platonic solids is validated by the fact that these shapes that we're talking about aren't just abstract shapes. As I said before in my previous talk, if we can't see this knowledge in nature, then it has no validity. And I'm constantly going back to nature as my great teacher. And here's some examples of the 5 Platonic solids as they're actually found in the microscopic world. There was a beautiful book by E.H. Haeckel, who did a report on the scientific results of the voyage of HMS Challenge in 1887, London. And he gave examples of the 5 regular solids as they're found in nature. We're looking at the exoskeleton of some marine animals called Radialara. So if you could look at these shapes and visualize that sometime there was a membrane around them when they were living organisms in the ocean, you could see that these were true living creations. Tetrahedron, octahedron, cube, icosahedron, dodecahedron. This is a very powerful diagram because it just says that this is truth. Nature is our truth. One of my mentors, or whose work I study, Victor Schauberger, his work's been translated by Professor Alan Coates, a colleague of mine, and his caption is "Copy and comprehend nature." That's the truth. He's a great scientist and his motto is "Copy and comprehend nature." And that's why I have such a high regard for the 5 Platonic solids, pretty much verified by this diagram. I've just recently discovered also that in the Oxford Museum in the UK, they have samples of some of these 5 Platonic solids carved in stone 10,000 years ago. So this is quite interesting, is like, which civilization was carving these 10,000 years ago, and why were they so obsessed about them? And if you look closely at them, the curators of the museum have actually wrapped some bands around them so you can actually define the facets a bit better. You can see clearly there's a cubic form in here. And you can see that there's a pentacle there, that's the dodecahedron. You can see small triangles here, that must be icosa. And this appears to be like an octahedral crystal. Here we have a diagram done by Kepler, about 16th century, and he was the one that gave us the original nesting of the 5 Platonic solids. He did this in his work called Mysterium Cosmographicum around 1609, and it was a sun-centered planetary model. It was this model that contradicted the previous Copernicus model where the Earth was in the center. So this was quite a revolutionary stream of thought to put out a cosmological system based on the 5 Platonic solids, when up to that point we were still thinking that the Earth was the center of the solar system. So it's pretty much like the nesting of the solid symmetries. What I want to read out is his famous quote, and this is what he's known for. He's often quoted for saying that geometry has 2 great treasures. One is the theorem of Pythagoras, which is what we looked at with 1 squared plus 1 squared equals root 2. And the other is the division of a line into the extreme and mean ratio. That's the phi ratio. The first we may compare to a measure of gold, the second we may name a precious jewel. Because to travel through these shapes, we're utilising the mathematics of nature. The relationship between icosa dodecahedron in the middle allows us to grow in consciousness. Okay, so we're just looking very closely now at this very stark geometry in straight lines. It's very masculine geometry. What I'd like to do now is contrast the same diagram with the opposite in a feminine type geometry. So if we look at this diagram here, you'll see the same nesting of shapes but within the flower, and I'm contrasting this shape to the nesting of the Platonic solids here done by Kepler. They're kind of like polar opposites. I believe that we're looking at the same thing. I believe that a woman would respond intuitionally to all this body of knowledge just by observing this splendor in the face of a flower, whereas a man like me needs to analyze and look into the logical components, one within the other. People often ask me, well, you know, what's the best definition of the golden mean spiral? And I often say that it would be the rose flower, because it's not really a number. People say it's a 1.618 ratio, but the best way to describe the phi ratio is to see it as the all-inclusive cascading harmonics, which is best described by the petals, the layers of the petals of the rose flower. It's not a number, it's a function, and to meditate upon this flower is equally as important as profound meditation on these shapes. A good example of what I'm talking about is not in the world of Platonic solids, but another family or subfamily called Archimedean solids. The shape that you're looking at here doesn't have the same faces. It's not a Platonic solid because they're not all the same faces. Can you see it's got squares and triangles? It's something different. And there's 13 Archimedean solids, which is what we're going to talk about a bit later. But you think that you're looking at 2 different things here. I'm saying to you that they're actually identical. Now, to explain the origin of what I'm saying, if I posed another problem to you, I said, imagine that there's a sphere. Imagine the sphere in the middle here, right in the middle. And if I said to you, here's a sphere, how many spheres can pack around an original sphere so that all the spheres are touching each other? We call this kissing spheres. This is what we call sphere packing. So you can see straight away that there's only one solution to this ancient problem, to this ancient puzzle, and that only 12 spheres can pack around a central sphere. And you could say, oh, that's another code, it's 12, but there's really 13. This is a 12-13 code. There's the 12 encompassing spheres, but we have one in the middle. So it kind of reminds you that when someone like Jesus or a bodhisattva, an enlightened person, can truly expand their love so much, their nucleus, and share that love, that they gravitate immediately 12 beings around them, in a sense. So this is the 1213 code. Now remember I said before with the jewels that if you were a spider and you were inside of this geometry and you were connecting the 12 centers, so imagine the center of those 12 little balls and you connect them, you would get this shape here. You would get this shape. So this is the feminine geometry, this is the masculine geometry. It's the same thing. I resonate to this shape called cube octahedron, which is Buckminster Fuller's toy. This is a compressible shape that I'm going to show later on. And a woman would resonate to the 12 spheres. So this is just to explain the gender in sacred geometry. This series of slides now is just to show you more individual photos just on the tetrahedron, icosahedron, dodecahedron, on each one of the 5. So we're just looking at some more graphics on the tetrahedron. And like I said before, I want to be able to see that these shapes are real, tangible, and they're in the natural kingdom. So as you can see from this slide here, that these fossils of the pollen are all tetrahedral. They're all based on the tetrahedron. And here's some more over here. Tetrahedral microfossilized spores, whereas before we were looking at grains and pollen, but the spores are also tetrahedral, all of them. So why does nature prefer this optimum shape? There must be something very universal in terms of least volume and maximum surface area. It's the optimum shape. When I say optimum shape, let us imagine that we have a sphere, a large sphere, but it's actually a soap bubble. So I've got a huge soap bubble in front of me. We'll call it a perfect sphere. Now if I was to insert a wet straw into that and suck some air out, like sip out of a straw, I'm actually pulling out some of the air that's holding it stable. So what it's going to do to compensate, it's going to compress. So this sphere will literally contract, and it would actually form in front of your eyes this dodecahedron. So this is nature's optimal form, is the dodecahedron, which is really created from the tetrahedron too, when you look back to the basic building block, which is why nature uses tetrahedral geometry. One of my mentors was Buckminster Fuller, who talked a lot about the stability of the tetrahedron being more superior than a cube. If you sit on a cube, it's not strong, it'll slant and just tip over, but this shape here is much more stronger. So he had a whole cosmology based on this shape. And what we're looking at in the diagram up here is that he understood the tetrahedron is based on a vector system as a model of quantum, and he kind of explained how it took 2 components to make this one unit. So I've got my magnetic toy here. If I pull this apart, so this, what we're looking at here is 1/2, and then we put the complementary other half together, and so the 2 halves come together to make a total stable structure. Buckminster Fuller was also responsible for creating a lot of octahedral and tetrahedral roof trusses, which are the most strongest systems we have at the moment in engineering. So all his designs go back to the ability of the tetrahedron to keep compacting and compressing itself into an infinitely stable structure. When you think about it, the biggest dome in the world at the time was like St. Peter's Cathedral in Rome. Like 150 years ago, the St. Peter's Cathedral was considered the biggest dome in the world. And when Buckminster Fuller evolved this system of tetrahedral packing and building, we were able to build great expanses of domes far bigger than the cathedral at St. Peter's. So this was the solution to creating amazing buildings. At the time of Pythagoras, there was a famous female mystic called the Oracle of Delphi, and people travelled from all the corners of the world to consult her. Kings and queens who were wanting to know whether or not they're going to win the war would come to this oracle, and she was found to be sitting on a huge tetrahedral chair, sitting above an abyss, and from this abyss came some kind of white smoke, and it put her into a trance. So she would go into a trance while someone here is reading the questions, and the kings and queens are sort of waiting for her ability to divine what's going to happen in the future. So I was always fascinated by the tetrahedral shape of this throne that she sat on, as if it gave her some kind of exceptional powers. Maybe it didn't, but it's also taken from Manly P. Hall's book, The Secret Teachings of All Ages. So I believe that she was contemporary to the time of Pythagoras. I'm particularly interested in showing you a little bit more on the octahedron, and you'll see closely when we look at the division of the cell, from the original cell, all the chromosomes within the original cell, as they start forming poles, form an octahedral kind of shape within the sphere, if you notice that. And then from that equator centre here, they start splitting mitotically, and then we end up, the one becomes the two. It's kind of symbolic of unity and duality that we're in now. But at some midpoint process, there's some sort of sacred geometry shape that's allowing the genetic information to coherently partition so that the one does separate perfectly. The reason why I'm showing you this picture on mitosis is that I'm quite interested in the beginnings of our journey here on Earth when we began as a sphere. Most people accept that we were a single-celled entity called a zygote, which is the union of the father-mother DNA. When the two came together in love, we were created out of love, out of the expansion of our parents' love, we were created. So symbolically we could say that we were one entity, one consciousness. We'll call it a sphere. And then at one moment the one became the two, and then the two became the four. That's kind of symbolic of a binary system. It's a doubling sequence when we go 2, 4, 8, 16. A lot of people are familiar with that. So when we became 4 spheres, you can see here in the diagram that how would 4 spheres compact or compress? These are the key words here. The key words are perfect compression. 4 spheres aren't going to lay flat like on a table. 4 spheres are going to form a pyramid. So here's the tetrahedron. So in an uncanny sense, if you accept this, then we were a tetrahedron. That's why it's part of your genetic memory, because the shape stores the memory in its coherent ability to hold data, the DNA, the genetic memory. So I'm calling this little segment the cosmogenesis. It's our connection back to source, when we were the one, but we did separate, but we separated gracefully in phases. And then when the 4 became the 8, as you understand, the 4, each of those one spheres separated became 8 spheres. So the next intelligent question is, well, how do 4 8 cells pack spherically? How do they lay flat on the ground? I've already shown you this. We understood that 8 cells decided to coherently become a cube, or more intelligently, really, it's a star tetrahedron. So this is part of your genetic memory. So what I'm teaching is that all sacred geometry is already in your DNA. It's not something to seek externally. This is about internal Merkaba. Merkaba means the ability to unify polarities. We're coming back to join all polarities so that we are connected back to source. That's what these 2 tetrahedrons are doing. They're reuniting to remember the oneness. So this has got to do with your 8 original cells. And you might say, well, this is the atomic structure of silicon chip, which I'm going to show you soon. This is the atomic structure of silicon chip molecule, which kind of says that even though we're working in this computer age, by tuning into the actual silicon chip in the computers, we can share a consciousness with these machines, so that they're like living machines, and we can turn this technology into a living technology that's resonant with our DNA as we start communing with this technology without judging it, but becoming part of it, because its memory is the same as our genetic memory. It's the same. This segment on relating to the sacred geometry in the DNA in our cells is inspired by the incredible work by a plant geneticist called Derald Langham, and he spent his life researching the chromosomes and genes of plants, but then suddenly he turned his attention to studying the zygote, this fascination for the original fusion of 2 cells becoming the one. And he gave us some extraordinary pictures of those first moments of life when the cell divided, when the 1 became the 2, became the 4, became the 8. And he concluded that when we became 1632 cells, this stark geometry that we're looking at now, the Platonic solid symmetry, it all just collapsed. And then we became a shape called the torus donut, tube torus donut. And he has a diagram here that I'll show you of the dimpling of the sea urchin. When the sperm penetrated the female sexual cell, the original sphere dimples, and birth or creation begins from the dimpling of the sphere, which is a donut shape. And here's the diagrams of the first cells of the field mice. So there's the 1, becomes the 2, becomes the 4, and then the geometry starts getting too big and it collapses. So I wanted to show you clearly a better picture of this donut shape that we're talking about. So by the time we got to 32 and 64 cell division, the geometry collapses into this exquisite shape of the tube torus donut, which explains why we're all fascinated by this toy that we've been playing with. It's not just a toy anymore. It's actually a key component of your memory. And what Derald Langham is explaining to us is that we evolved out of this tube torus shape, and there's 2 openings. This became your mouth, and this bottom bit here became your anus. And as this kind of swelled and kept on doubling to 128, 256, it started to form a spiral shape. So most of you are familiar with the fetal shape being like a fern leaf that's kind of unfolding. So even the shape of the golden mean spiral is part of our memory. We've looked at the tetrahedron, cube, octahedron. Now we're looking at the 2 important Platonic solids that are based on the golden mean ratio. If you look closely at this diagram with the icosahedron, when we analyze it internally, joining corners to corners, you'll see that the axes are based on 3 rectangles. But these rectangles are quite important rectangles because they're based on the mathematics of where the elbow bends. So if this distance is 1, this longer length is 1.618. And over here, we've got the same here with the dodecahedron, that the internal axes are all based on this critical wavelength called the golden mean ratio. And these 2 are an eternal pair, icosa, dodeca, icosa, dodeca. I'd like to show you a diagram now that fuses the icosa dodeca into 1, so you get an understanding that it's just a 1 unit, but it's a unit that has the ability to expand and to contract. If you look at the shaded area here, we can see that there's penticles, so that's the dodecahedron, but when we stellate that dodecahedron and expand it, it grows into 20 triangular faces, and that's the icosa. So that's a beautiful representation, and we're looking also at the shadow of that three-dimensional form. It's a 10-sided shape. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So that's the deck view of the icosadodeca matrix. It's a very important and very powerful diagram. And these shapes here, these polygon shapes, polyhedrons, these were drawn by people at the time of Kepler and Michelangelo and Leonardo. They were all obsessed in their spare time by constructing and painting and connecting these shapes together. So some scientists and metaphysicians have come together and they've decided that the Earth isn't really just a pure sphere. It's a bit like an apple that's a bit dimpled on the poles. And they've studied all the earthquake anomalies around the planet, and they realise that a lot of these fault lines around the planet are actually falling along the lines of a pentacle. So the three-dimensional view of the pentacle is the dodecahedron. This is the dodecahedron. It's the three-dimensional view of the pentacle. Just if you think of as a square is really a cube, a triangle is a tetrahedron. Well, what you're looking at now is, well, what's the three-dimensional view of the pentacle? This is what the pagans were really originally worshipping. It wasn't just the pentacle, that was just the shadow of a higher principle called dodeca. So this is the Hagen model of the fault lines around the Earth, showing that there is an incredible relationship between all the sacred sites. Like here's the Bermuda Triangle. As you can see, all these 10 lines, like the 10 sides of a decagon, here's all these 10 lines crossing right here at the Bermuda Triangle. So places like the Stonehenge, Pyramid, Easter Island, they're all on the vertexes of this dodecahedron. But we have the icosadodeca. This icosadodecaedron has another name. Another current name for the icosadodecaedron is called the Christ Consciousness Grid. Apparently in the 1920s, and every 20 years successively, some experiments went wrong, called the Philadelphia experiment. There was a time when we could open up the fabric of time and space and go and travel interdimensionally. The military were doing operations to turn their ships invisible so that they could have a better form of attack by being invisible in a war zone. So they did these invisibility experiments and it went drastically wrong. It involved spinning ratios according to the sunflower 34-21 frequency. It was all because of the bad intention. It couldn't work because any invention is only as good as the consciousness of the people creating it. So if you have malintent to corrupt or deceive or enslave, the experiments went wrong. And what happened was we ripped a hole in the fabric of time and space and we didn't know how to heal it. So the angels have come in, if you believe this fairy story, that we're here to repair the fabric that got damaged by man's attempt to control and enslave. So we believe that by fusing these two shapes, the dodeca and the icosa, if they could literally become one, what that means is that on every face of the dodecahedron, on every pentacle face that you see, could you imagine a pyramid of 5 sides coming out like this? So we take these 5 pyramid shape and we glue it onto the 12 faces of the dodeca, and that's what we've created here, icosadodeca. So this is a model that's kind of accepted by many people, but also it's not the only model. It could change. We can work with whatever shape we choose. We can work with whatever shape we choose. So when we talk about Merkaba, Mer means counter-rotating, and the Ba is the body, the Ka is the spirit. So Merkaba is very much likened to your spiritual light body, and you can select or choose whichever shape that you resonate to as your vehicle for traveling through time and space. When we go to the halls of learning or halls of healing, whatever way we leave our body, we select a spiritual light vehicle to do that with. And that's what this sacred geometry is about. It's about becoming unlimited and its ability to travel beyond this dimension. But we need to know how to come back. So that's why this grid's been activated now with the celestial help, because we've really opened up a lot of wounds in Mother Earth, and a lot of too many ultra frequencies are penetrating the planet now that weren't coming in before. If we think of ultraviolet lights, that are too much is flooding us at the moment. It perhaps could be a clue as to why there's an acceleration with consciousness at the moment. The consciousness is speeding up. Many people are learning many